on the surface, you are saying yes, right? You are giving off signals of a yes. And that requires a lot more capacity on the person receiving that fake yes to find other signals, either in what they know about you or what your body might be saying in that moment, even if your words are saying yes, or something about the situation that they are reading, like they're picking up on these other signs and interpreting as correctly that, oh yes, they might be saying a yes, but they're not actually a yes.
Welcome back to Open Late Podcast. I'm your host, Jessica Spandiari, and this is our 100th episode. 100 episodes is kind of a crazy feat, and at the same time, I feel like I just started this podcast yesterday. I mean, for a year and a half, we have recorded with some incredible guests. We've had crazy, silly times. I've shared really intimate, sometimes challenging, sometimes very sexy moments about my personal life. And overall, I feel like I've been able to help so many people navigate the journey from a traditional relationship to something else created by design. And that makes me really happy. So when thinking about what we wanted to share for our 100th episode, I wanted to have a conversation that was different, that was inspired by what's happening in my life at the moment. And I wanted to bring some badass women to do it with me. So today I am joined by two incredible women who are also in the space of education, non-traditional relationship styles, research, activism, and overall a big part of this community of sex positivity. So I want to tell you a little bit about each of them before we dive in. Ginger Banks is a dear friend of mine turned sister over the last few years. She was my very first podcast guest, so go and check out episode 1, The Accidental Threesome, and she's since been back a few times. Ginger is someone who I look up to for her passionate activism, for destigmatizing the sex work industry, and her innovation in ethical porn. She's won awards for fostering conversations about trauma, harm reduction, and stigmatized spaces. She provides a non-judgmental place for people to share their experiences. I am also being joined today by Dr. Zhana Vrangalova. Dr. Zhana is a sexuality and relationship scientist, writer, and consultant based in New York City who helps sexually adventurous and non-traditional individuals build extraordinary lives. I fucking love Zhana because she challenges society's view that indulging in our sexual desires cannot be safe or healthy or ethical by using scientific research and her extensive personal experiences. She's also created the Open Smarter course, which you've heard me talk about a bunch. And she joined us to talk about that course back on episode 83, Sexual Happiness Leads to Life Happiness. So go and check that out. And just know that Zhana has given 30% off of that course to all of the Open Late listeners when you use the code Jessica. She is also a peer turned friend in this space. And she's one who's truly demystifying the road to non-monogamy. Okay, so that was a mouthful, but why are we here? Well, the three of us frequent these sex positive spaces, these play party communities, and at times we find ourselves at the same ones. And recently we found ourselves in a conversation around a topic that's not often talked about publicly, if at all. What happens when something goes wrong in one of these spaces, in one of these communities? How do you know if the transgression was intentional? What's the scale, right? What's the protocol? Who do you talk to about it? And what are the steps to resolve it and move forward? This is a lot to bite off today, but there are no better people to have this conversation with. So I want to welcome Ginger and Dr. Zhana back to the show. Welcome to the show, ladies.
Nice to be here.
Yeah. So today we're going to be sort of tackling this big conversation that the three of us have been having along with some of our other, peers in the space of this sex positive community in Los Angeles, as well as in New York, where Dr. Zhana is. And really how we navigate conversations and experiences when things don't go well in that space, and how we've found, that while our lived experiences can be very different, we also share so many similarities when it comes to how we feel empowered or how we feel disempowered, how we handle our trauma responses. And I think in our conversation, we were like, wow, I've never really heard anyone talk about this publicly before. And I think the three of us were sort of saying how we have these platforms, as educators, as activists in this space, and yet there's really no framework for how to talk about it. And so that's what we're going to do today. I know that I even get a little nervous when I talk about these things. And so I'm just going to call myself out there like first and say, even thinking about doing this episode, I want to do it well, but there really is no way to do it right because I feel like we are sort of in uncharted territory. Yeah. So let's dive into these topics. If there's anything that is like right away on your heart space that either of you want to share, I guess we can start there and sort of jump into like what our lived experiences are.
I think that I've been to such a wide variety of like sex parties, sex positive communities. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that these like aren't like these organizations are made up of people, and every person has their individual like issues that they need to be working out in order to be creating safe spaces and in order to be like safe people in these spaces. And so I think that's something to remember when we talk about like certain organizations, like they're just made up of people, like every organization is.
Yes. And also another point about the huge diversity that exists in how these different spaces navigate their experiences of what is appropriate, what is inappropriate, what's consensual, what's non-consensual. And I've been part of play parties and sex positive communities around the country here in the US, as well as in several different places in Europe. And there's quite a bit of variability in how people navigate these spaces. And I think it's important to kind of know what we're signing up for when we go to these different kinds of spaces. But ultimately, the sex positive world, and especially the way we're building it out in the US, especially over the last few years, has really tried to be a world that is very conscious of consent, is very respectful of people's boundaries, and they really try in different ways. These different organizations will do it in somewhat different ways, but there is this general commitment to making sure that we're elevating our consent practices. And in many cases, those consent practices in these spaces are, in fact, much higher. And those spaces are, in some ways, much safer than many of these kind of regular clubs that one might go to, or regular parties that people might think, oh, it's safer because people have their clothes on, but they're not necessarily safer. So
Yeah. I love the point that both of you are making too, that, this is like sex is such a reflection of life, right? And evolution and society and sort of what our personal experiences are. It's like as above, so below. So these societies are broad, and you can find any different experience within, a play party community as you can in a regular nightclub, as you can walking down Fifth Avenue. And so it is important to remember that not everyone has the education. Not every space is even intended to be safe or is intentional, even if it seems that way from the outside. And yet, even if a space is intentional and has, a lot of the correct elements and has education around these things, I think we're also still so young in the dawn of consent culture and, on this journey of diversity and inclusion and feeling into energetics about like what consent really is and safety, is like a lot of the conversations that we've been having, that it's a lot to expect, and we can't expect it to be perfect because no one is perfect at the end of the day, and we're all bringing our stuff to it. And that's, I think, like what you were speaking to in the beginning, Ginger, of like, these are people and people are flawed. And so I think it would be interesting and cool if we heard from, each other. And I'll go first as to like what our experiences have been, like a highlight, so that the listeners get an idea of like, okay, this is like a little blip of Jessica's history and like her experiences. This is a blip of Jana's. This is a blip of Ginger's. And we can sort of let that be the platform. And my experience, I always say like I'm the most boring polyamorous person or sex party person like on the internet, but it's actually not true. I've had my fair share of fun times. I've never found myself part of a community. Like I've never gone back to a party space more than twice in the 10 years that I have been in this space. But I've had orgies at Burning Man. I've been to the Kit Kat Club. I've also been to, communities in Los Angeles that are higher end with really high ticket prices where, we'll speak to some of this later, but people have these like wild accusations and conspiracy theories of like what's happening at certain parties. I have been uncomfortable at parties. I have sort of looked around myself and wondered, are people here not because they want to be, but because they're being paid a ton? Are there things here happening that people don't want to happen to them? That girl doesn't look happy. Like, and I've had those thoughts myself. I've been at parties where I've been uncomfortable, where someone's come and like thrown their arm around me and sort of groped me a bit, in a way that I left feeling like I'll never go back to that space. Or I was being watched a bit too closely, and that's just like the things that have happened to me. I've never been assaulted at a party. I have been assaulted in public, in a nightclub, in broad daylight in Greece, by
Yeah.
an old man in a grocery store. Like, so these are, just the lived experiences that I think probably a lot of people listening are resonating with. And nothing that's ever happened to me negatively in a party space has made me not want to go back because my curiosity and my appetite is so strong. So, um, you know, I want to hear from the two of you, and I'm sure it's similar and maybe different and wild in some ways that the listeners will love to hear. And I'm going to turn it over to you ladies to share maybe some highlights or maybe some defining moments in your experiences.
Sure. Yeah, so I don't think I'm the most boring person, sex party person on the planet. Probably on the other end of the
Yeah.
spectrum. I started my play party career in my early 20s when I lived in Berlin for a few months, and the Kit Kat Club at the time, it was a different Kit Kat Club than the one today. It's changed a couple of different locations, was my entry into that world. And it was quite the entry because that place is unlike anything I've experienced before or since in many of these other spaces, and just Berlin in general. And I've been to a lot of other Berlin-based clubs and play parties, as well as a lot of the different New York-based parties. And unlike Jessica, I have been to the same party again and again and again and again. And I have considered myself part of a couple of different communities in New York, both the kinds of places that are a sex club that operates on an ongoing basis, is open a couple of times or several times a week, as well as those play parties that happen on a less regular basis, like once a month or once every couple of months, and bring together a kind of a specific group of people with a specific list. And as well as, have checked out more one-off in a more one-off way various other parties in LA and San Francisco and Vegas and Denver and Miami and I don't know, a lot of different parts of the US. And as well as a lot of private events, because they're a big part of the ecosystem of the sex positive space is also these more private events that might be organized in people's houses. And yeah, I've seen a lot of different things happen. I've had experiences where I've definitely been made to feel uncomfortable. I've gotten groped non-consensually at a number of different of these locations. I've definitely had the experience of being watched too closely. I mean, the Kit Kat Club is just notorious for that. You start doing anything sexual, and then 3 seconds later, you have literally a circle of 20 people around you watching and jerking off over you. Um, I've definitely seen people approach people in ways that I felt was, too aggressive or didn't seem consensual. I've seen people acquiesce to things that they didn't seem like they wanted to do. I also recently had an experience like that myself, where I was approached in a way that didn't feel right and properly negotiated, and yet I acquiesced to that. And so that was an interesting new experience for me to be in. Yeah.
Thank
I
you
don't
for
know.
sharing.
I
Yeah.
can keep going, but I think I'll wrap it up for now.
Yeah. I was just going to comment too, like my Kit Kat Club experience was probably like one of my highlights, where I felt was like such a safe and not weird space to be in. Because when I was doing things that were very sexual, people kept their distance from me. And so just like, but I've been there once. So, you lived there. And so it just goes to show like every single experience is so nuanced, and we all operate in these like little realities that we have had this lived experience. And so that's our view of what this space is then. And that's like what we'll share with people. So
Yeah. And things like people just like jumping into a scene when you're already engaging in a scene, and it's not necessarily clear that these people are welcome. There's all sorts of things that have happened.
yeah. Yeah. Ginge, I'm ready, so ready to hear your experience too, since you have like also a very different lens to jumping into this from, being in sex work.
Yeah, the first time I was ever invited to a sex party was actually through some friends that I was filming content with. It was to Kinky Rabbit Club. It's like the sister club, I would say, of Sanctum, which is like a lot of celebrities go to these parties. And obviously that was so intriguing to me as someone who lived in Arizona. And I think that they're just like an offshoot of society. Like good and bad things happen at the club, good and bad things happen at sex clubs, good and bad things happen like all over the world. And there's no such thing as a perfect space, like a ultimately safe space, because like I said, we're all humans, we're all flawed, we're all going to make mistakes. And I think it's really important, like how we decide we're going to have like conflict resolution with the people who do cross our boundaries, if we are going to stay in that community, because it is very easy to just jump from community to community, because if something like that happens, because I'm not going to say it's always going to happen, but like even when I went to an all girls sex party, I felt like certain girls were like a little too aggressive and things like that. So it's not just like a completely gendered thing. It's a very complicated issue. And I have noticed that some of the parties where like guys are paying a little bit more money, they come off a little bit more entitled, which makes sense. Like it all comes down to expectations. And I think a lot of entitlement is tied to expectations to getting laid, expectations like the more money I pay, I expect more, things like that. That's why I was like kind of like drawn a little bit more towards parties where the women actually had to pay and other things like that. Because if you're not paying for something, you usually are the currency. That's usually what I've been taught. So as a girl who's gotten into a lot of these sex parties for free, I've had to be very forward with like, look, I don't care that you work at Disney. I don't care about any of this shit. Like, if I'm not attracted to you, I don't want to hook up with you. So like, don't come off as entitled. Don't try and offer me all of these things. Like, it's not going to work. I'm here to connect with people. And so I've had good things happen, honestly, in the sex like positive space with the emphasis on consent being so much like there's so much more of it compared to the regular world, I think I have had way more positive experiences. And if something has transgressed that was bad, I feel completely safe to go to that person and speak my truth to them. And because I think it's really important if someone transgresses us to like tell them how they hurt us and how they affected us, because I don't think there's any other way that their behavior is going to change if we just completely remove ourselves from the situation. And I totally understand if you don't feel safe enough to talk about someone like that. It's a privilege if you feel safe enough to do that. But that's one of the things that I've noticed in these communities is I do feel safe enough that if something does happen, I can go to them. And I also notice in these communities, there's a lot of like consent documents, and I see that they're ever evolving. And I see that they're like adding more nuanced situations. Like, I read one recently that had something I had never seen before, which was to be aware that if you are a leader of one of these communities, that people are going to feel more pressured to engage in sexual activity with you because they want to be a part of that community. And it doesn't mean you have to like do anything. There's no expectations on that other than if you're someone who cares about consent, then you want to know about these nuances and how people might feel like pressured to have sex with you. So I don't know, I think these spaces can be incredibly empowering and educating and safe, but like any other space, I've seen like people who give their venue for free. Usually those dudes are the creepiest and the weirdest. Like they're at the party for free. They normally probably never would have been invited to this party, but because the venue is so expensive and they're getting this fucking mansion for free, there's some creepy dude who's walking around the party that's like, hey, you can stay here if you want, like stuff like that. I'm like, who is this guy? Why is there a single guy here? So I think that it's important to be aware of like how maybe if you're, maybe you let the venue owner be a little bit creepier than you would like someone else because he's giving you something in return and things like that. It's just like, I think just needs to be an ongoing conversation. And I appreciate the people who are receptive to feedback, because I've said a lot of this to venue people or like the people who throw these parties is like, you need to be aware of who you give more lenience to their bad behavior.
Yeah. Wow, there's so much here. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Yeah.
You answered like 7 of the questions that we have coming up.
Yeah, I was going to say this is all so great because we're going to talk a lot about this and we're going to get more and more into each thing.
It's also interconnected. It's really hard to talk about one thing without talking about another thing,
Yes. And that's actually something I think we've been finding as we've been sharing our experiences over the last couple of weeks is like, oh, okay, this is leading me here. This is leading me here. Oh, okay, this is something that like we sort of probably saw the same thing in different experiences. And we're hearing a lot of do's and don'ts too in Gingers. And I think we can frame this later. And like, what is a red flag? Special treatment for different people and friends of organizers. And one of the things that you're kind of speaking to, I think also, and both of you actually, Dr. Zhana as well, is like when these communities go from being groups of friends to being a business, there's a jump in like responsibility to the community and the people around you. And then also like money is being made. And I think like we all have a mutual friend. Oh, actually, Dr. Jana, you don't know her yet, but we're going to introduce you to Irene.
Oh
I really
yeah.
make that connection today. You like must meet Irene.
Oh
And
yeah.
Ginger knows her so well. And her and her partner have started a community. And yeah, that they're like in this interesting place where they're like, we don't really want it to be a business, and everyone wants them to grow because they're like an incredible community. And we find that like they're of the highest standard that we would look for, which doesn't mean that bad things don't happen, because like we've all been there. And of course, there's people there that you're like, this person doesn't fit in the community. But I think like to take it back to what we've experienced at a community that is like a play party selling tickets, there's like a level of responsibility that then these organizers inherit. And it's like, do they even realize the depth of that? And in some of the conversations, what I wanted to bring up and sort of jump into next is, what are the responsibilities of these people from our perspective as party goers, as community members, as peers who want to see them do well? Because I think like we all see a lot of potential in like some of these creative, like brilliant people who want to create a safe space. Like, I know that's their intention. I think we all agree that. But it's like, where do you have to then draw the line? How do you have to do the most on consent and education? Like, if you are the organizer, like, should you also have to stay sober? And should you have all these members on your team that like have to be sober at a party, so that like there is also someone who is in control like at all times and that you can go to? um I think that's
Yes.
like a good place to start a conversation around that, because we probably all have different opinions on this thing too. So I'm like, my gosh, like if I was going to start a play party, like, do I also want to like educate people on like consent and like make people have to jump through hoops? Like, of course, I would say like I want to do an in-person interview with every single person and, have tests and have this and that. But like, what if my friend wants to come last minute and they're in town from Alabama? And I'm like, well, they didn't do the screening process. Like, do they get to come because they're my friend, or my friend got a little too drunk at the party? Am I going to kick them out or do I let them stay? Like, there are all these nuances. And where do
Those are,
we like what do we expect from these people?
yeah, I mean, those are a lot of different questions and there's a lot of different details. And I don't know that we can maybe get into all of the different details, but it's a great question of what is the expectation. And the way I see it is the expectations or set of expectations are that you're really going to think deeply about and consult with other people in your community, especially women, non-binary folks, in addition to men, because yeah, as Ginger was saying, this is not just a gendered thing, but there is a massive gender difference in how often some of these consent violations happen, and people walk away feeling hurt in one way or another. And so what is think really deeply about what is the form of consent and level of consent that you're going to have at your party. It can be navigated in different ways, but that needs to be clear and obvious. Then that needs to be communicated in very clear ways to the people who are coming to that party. And the more ways to communicate that, the better. And the clearer ways there are to communicate, the longer ways there are to communicate, the better. So I would love to see, and a lot of parties don't do this, but I would love to see more parties doing like longer consent workshops, because very often, different places will set a standard. Like it has to be a fuck yes. If it's a fuck yes, if it's not a fuck yes, then it's a fuck no. But people don't know what a fuck yes is, what that looks like very often, or they don't know how to navigate that. And so I feel like there needs to be more education on that, whether it's through a video, whether it's through an in-person workshop, whether it's in a way that all newbies have to come at the party an hour before and go through some kind of consent education. And then there are a number of different uh, um, things that people can do at the event itself. Having angels, guardians, dungeon monitors, those are all different kind of names for people who are there to make sure that non-consensual behavior is not happening. So to have enough of those people, I think those people should absolutely be sober, to your question. And I have been to many parties where those people are not sober and they're not doing their job well. I think the owners and the people kind of running the show, as Ginger was saying, they absolutely need to be aware of the power dynamic that creates and how they're approaching people. And so they need to kind of hold themselves to an even higher level of consent standard that really makes sure that the people that they're going to play with, if they play with them, are truly interested in that and have full consent to do that. And then I think there's got to be a way to make it easy and comfortable for people to come forward if something inappropriate has happened, because no matter how many of these different things we incorporate before and during the events, things are still going to happen because, as we're saying, people are people and we're flawed. And whether it's because of just lack of knowledge, or because someone got too high or too drunk, or because someone was a bad seed who should not have gotten through that screening process, whatever that screening process is, then there's got to be a way to address that, to make it easy and comfortable for people to come forward anonymously or not anonymously, and then a process by which organizers will follow up with those people and figure out what happened, if there needs to be some re-education, if there needs to be some punishment, if there whatever is appropriate. Different things will be appropriate in different cases. In all cases, though, I completely agree with Ginger. We have to talk about these things. Someone has to talk to the people who transgressed. If that's the person who was transgressed upon and they feel comfortable to do that, then great. That, whether alone or with some sort of a mediator in the room, or if they're not comfortable, then the organizers or someone else needs to do that work.
Yeah. Wow. So lots of great input and steps here on how people can really achieve like highest standard when they're thinking about doing these parties. Um, I have been to so many where the organizers, are definitely not sober, and there's not a lot of sober people in the room. And it's interesting that you brought up too, like the power dynamic, which I never really pinpointed until now. And if I can share, in our like mini conversation that we had when we were at a party together, I was like, yeah, I don't really play like at parties. And there's many reasons why. But as I was thinking more and more about it, and you were sharing with me that like kind of have a similar take, it has to be like the right kind of group of people. I'm realizing too that it's because like also everybody knows who I am in these spaces now when I go. And so it's like there's also that. And I don't want people to either just want to connect with me for that reason. And then also like I think about the influence that I have in these spaces, and I want to like use it for something really good, and I also don't know what I want it to be. And when you cross over into that realm of like this is fun, but this also is kind of business, there's so much more responsibility that comes with that. And it's interesting to be a woman in these spaces and like think that I think that I'm like so empowered and so solid in my choices. But when you're speaking to like, it's important for people to go to the organizers or, the transgressor and communicate like what they can do better. And like Ginger, you're so great at that too, like right up front when something goes wrong. Whereas I've been the one to hang back and been like, I have to talk about this, but like I can't talk to the person. And realizing that that's an area where I really need to grow. And I'm also at a really interesting spot in my life where I have so much going on, like, expecting like the biggest life shift ever, and learning how to hone in my energy and like not give it to things that are going to be a big draw on my energy right now. So it was like a personal choice also. And I think that's like how we ended up here, is like I felt like I could talk to you both and be really comfortable in that, but also didn't have the energy or feel empowered to go and share to a party organizer or someone that I didn't feel comfortable with. And so, yeah, I'm just like even going to sit with that. That's like, well, I'll leave that there. And I'm curious to hear like your thoughts, Ginge, if you have anything that you want to add on this.
Oh yeah. I think I think the thing that makes Curiosity Bears different, and I need to give Irene immense credit for this, is that she's trauma informed, and the entire community is trauma informed, and she integrates that into everything. I think there's only so much that you can learn about consent without being informed on trauma as well. Like, I really actually don't see consent talks that are trauma informed, now that I'm thinking about it, outside of the ones that are at Curiosity Bears, because I think it's important to talk about how people fawn, how people like, these are trauma responses. And even now that I'm thinking about this, like, if someone was potentially really traumatized by something, like it's re-traumatizing to talk about it again. So potentially talking with that person again is going to be something that's going to re-traumatize you. So these are all things that are like we just need to be aware of in this day and age. And I think like people, it's all comes down to like the unraveling of ourselves and understanding like what motivates, like I asked this, like what motivates someone to commit sexual assault, what motivates someone to cross a boundary. And the pattern that I have seen a lot is that someone will go out and they'll get rejected by someone, and then that is where subconsciously they start to go out and they're like, no, I need to prove myself. I need to deal with this negative feeling. Like I have to get with someone now. Now I'm really expecting to get with someone. And that's where I see this entitlement and like potential sexual assault coming from. So I don't even think people are aware of the fact that that's where their behavior is being motivated or coming from. You know, I don't think they ever like internalize these feelings and think like, why did I cross that person's boundary? And I want to have conversations where like, we can talk about this because I think it's more common than we think. I think people have done this in moments of like emotional, like immaturity to soothe themselves more than we realize. And I think that if we're going to talk about like how we're going to change this as society, we need to be having these conversations with the people that did this to us, if we can, and if we feel safe enough, without any expectation of what they're going to do after that. Because, you know, I like to share this information. And if they want to internalize it and come back to me and talk and have feedback, that's totally up to them. And if they want to externalize it and be like, no, it was you liked it, I'm probably not going to engage with that person going forward, because they are much more likely to reoffend. And that's what it comes down to, is like these people who reoffend over and over and over. And I want us to like, I don't want it to happen anymore.
Yeah. And I think that's like part of our conversation has been like, where do we see certain groups and communities going? Because there's a little bit of both mixed in into our current like experience in like what's been talked about and like what's been owned and what's been sort of like, oh, well, it's a two-way street in this situation. I think that we really like all get to take responsibility too, because when you were talking about like trauma response and fawning, like that's something that I did recently, completely out of what I would think is out of character for me. And then I realized it happened. And so I'm like, wow, this is like, how much of that experience is mine to own and is that person's to own? Like, how do I expect that person to be educated enough to know that they were crossing a boundary in that moment, and that when I said yes to something that I didn't actually mean yes? Like, when our society is not educating people on how to like properly be present to someone's like yes or no, when you can like hear a yes but a yes is really a no.
That's a really big and complicated question. I actually want to take us back for just a second and explain some of these terms, because I'm not sure how familiar people are with some of these trauma responses that we're talking about.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Right. There's usually people think of the fight and flight type of response when we're faced with some sort of danger. And that's something we're all familiar with. You either fight back or you run away. But there are these two other responses that people don't often think about that are quite common and present, especially in these sexual situations. That's the freeze and fawn response, with the freeze being obviously just freezing and not actually doing anything either way, or fawning, FAWN, that is basically acquiescing, basically saying yes when you're not actually a yes, because for some reason, in some way, whether consciously or unconsciously, you think that that is an easier response than saying no in some way, in the either fighting or flighting type of response. And both of these responses, the fight and flight are pretty obvious. They're a pretty obvious no response, and anyone can read that as a no. The freeze and fawn, on the other hand, are much more difficult to decipher. The freeze response is sort of ambiguous. The person not doing anything Well, sometimes people don't do anything because they're shy, or because they don't know what to do, even though they are liking what is happening to them. And so it can be this kind of ambiguous signal that could be interpreted one way or another. And people on the other side also, going back to what Ginger was saying, like, why do people cross boundaries? Sometimes people cross boundaries because they themselves are so excited about the situation that their own desire and their own excitement is sort of overpowering their ability to read these more ambiguous signs that the person is showing in an accurate way. And so if I'm just so eager to do something with someone and we're starting to do something and then they freeze, I might be like, oh no, it's fine, and interpret it in that way. And the fawn, so that the freeze is already pretty kind of complex and ambiguous and go either way. And the fawn response is even more difficult to dissect and get to the bottom of, because on the surface, you are saying yes, right? You are giving off signals of a yes. And that requires a lot more capacity on the person receiving that fake yes to find other signals, either in what they know about you or what your body might be saying in that moment, even if your words are saying yes, or something about the situation that they are reading, like they're picking up on these other signs and interpreting as correctly that, oh yes, that might be saying a yes, but they're not actually a yes. And it's a really difficult question to know whose responsibility is it in that moment, because yeah, we should be able to trust our words. And in fact, many of these play parties, especially in the US, have these rules of you have to ask before you touch, for example, right? There's got to be a verbal yes of some sort, verbal question and verbal response, affirmative response, in order for some intimacy to happen or escalation of intimacy to happen. But if that yes is a fawn response, then it's just as useless as a guide to what we should be doing as if there was no verbal confirmation. And so this is where it really becomes important, as Ginger was saying, to have trauma informed consent education of all of these people. And trauma is so common. It's so prevalent. We have the numbers are, something like 1 in 5, 1 in 4 women have had experience of rape, and that's full blown rape, right? And then there are all of these smaller versions of sexual assault, or either attempted rape or coercion, or being forced, being kind of coerced or forced to watch something you don't want to watch, or having been exposed to something you didn't want to be exposed to. So there's a lot of these other forms of sexual trauma that many of us have experienced that make the freeze and the fawn response much more likely, much more common than the fight or flight, these active ways of saying no. And, just like you had that experience of fawn recently, so did I. And that was a very new experience for me, a very out of character type experience, that someone who has been so much in my power, in my sexual power, very assertive in my yeses and nos. And yeah, all of a sudden at one point, at one of these events, I found myself is that saying yes to something that I was actually a pretty, you know pretty clear on the no end of the spectrum. And where did that come from? A huge part of it, I mean, there was more complexity to it. I had a lot of conflict, for example, in the situation about what I wanted to do and didn't want to do. Like, did I want to play with this person? Did I not? Did I want to do it here or not? Was this a work event for me or not? Because as you were saying, so at this point, being kind of more known in the community also places you in a somewhat different position. And so I always ask myself these days, like, do I want to play? Do I not want to play at these events? And But part of it was also because I've been recently dealing with some past sexual trauma that was unprocessed back in the day when it happened, and something that happened more recently had brought it to the surface. And so even me, even with this level of experience of having negotiated successfully so many sexual situations, even ones where, well, they were pretty dangerous and things could have gone in a really bad direction, did not go in a bad direction when I had my sort of full wits about me. But in this more vulnerable space that I was in more recently, I ended up in that fawn response. And yeah, so it's not an easy question of how much responsibility do we have for our responses, and how much responsibility do these other people have for reading our responses accurately.
Yeah. One of the things I just want to comment on too is it's pointing to, as people who are listening that are really excited about the idea of like going into these spaces and going to parties. And a lot of my listeners are just like at that, like want to go to my first party, or maybe re-enter a community now with my partner that I've been monogamous with for 10 years. It's like, I think also probably just great to hear that wherever you are in your journey, there's always going to be work to do and something might be triggered. Because, at the end of the day, I forget which one of you said this to me, but we all still have a little girl inside of us or a little boy inside of us, or a little still figuring it out and don't even realize like we're trans yet, whatever it is inside, who has been hurt, who has been traumatized, maybe not even acknowledging that it's trauma, that can pop back up at any point in your life. Because it's like, I'm like, oh, I'm real cute thinking I'm, this empowered woman who is like brought right back into this place of feeling like I didn't like have the opportunity to choose really. But it's also kind of in a way good to realize like you're never going to be done cooking on this journey. There's always going to be more work to do. And so we're not bulletproof when we step into these spaces. And that's why I think it's so important to what we're doing is kind of showcasing at this point that we sort of found each other and opened up to each other to talk about these things. And I think like that's probably the key here is having that affirming friend or group or community that you have on hand that okay, I'm going to like download my experience after, because there's going to be stuff in there. Like we're saying, it's a great space, not so great space. There's going to be like an array of experience when you maybe come home from a party or leave a party, or when you've been engaging in a community for a period of time. So just knowing that this is normal is probably like, I hope one of the biggest takeaways, if you're like writing down things from this episode, this is like one of the ones to put in the notebook of like, it's so important to then have the self-awareness and internalize, like, even when you think things went well, I did an interview that like the rest of that day I was like, I feel a little off, but I'm not sure why. And it wasn't until I went to my journal and was like, oh wait, this like something is not sitting well. And I went and was like, where am I responsible for this? Like, and I did fawn. And how did I show up? Like, even in the way that I was like communicating and asking questions and things like that. So I took this whole stock of my experience before. And I think that it's so important to do when you come out of these spaces or while you're even in these spaces to like really ask yourself those questions and know yourself before reacting or responding. Obviously, if you're in a traumatic situation, you want to respond right away. And that's something that we can talk to too, if we want to dive into like protocol for approaching, organizers beyond the fact or at a party when something goes wrong. But I think I just wanted to highlight like after an experience, whether it's an event or even just like something that happened in communication, where you want to like take that internal review of like what happened first. and really start to know yourself?
For me personally, I think it's really important for me to be in my body, which I think it makes it a lot safer that I don't drink because it really does put this time blindness on people. It's called myopia, where they actually only care about like what's happening now. They don't care about the consequences. And so that's something to think about when you're planning these sex parties and potentially integrating alcohol into it. There was something else I wanted to say too. What else was it?
Wait, real
Oh,
quick.
it's about
Myopia is the term for when someone is drinking,
yeah,
or I
they
think
experience this thing called myopia, which is kind of like a time blindness, if you think about it like that.
Myopia literally means nearsightedness.
Yeah, so like that with time myopia.
okay.
So
Thank you.
for me, being in my body and always asking myself in these experiences, how do I feel in my body right now? Like, is this a fuck yes? And if not, I have to be able to be like, okay, I'm about to disappoint this person, but that is not my fucking responsibility to like disappoint this person. Like, that's fine. Like, I've been rejected. They get to be rejected. Not everybody wants to fuck me. Not everybody wants to be fucked. And so, like, the quicker I am able to pull myself out of that fawning and say, look, I'm just not feeling this right now. And then if they keep going, like that's where the transgression becomes a giant red flag because I think there's a lot of environments where fawning happens and people potentially unintentionally cross your boundaries. But even in that scenario where I have fawned before, I've gone to the person, I said, look, I want you to tell me right now what leading up to that moment made you think that I wanted to have sex with you. And if there isn't any evidence, I'm like, look, like that's not okay. If there was no flirting beforehand, nothing like that, like don't come up to me and like just and ask if you can kiss me, like when I'm clearly like really fucking high. I might say yes right away because I'm fawning and then tell you to stop. And if you stop at that point, like that's all I can ask of someone. But I also want you to go back and think like, what made me come over to you and get on top of you and be like, hey, can I kiss you? And not realize like how much pressure goes into that and things like that. So I think there is some level of personal responsibility because I think the longer I fawn, the longer the person doesn't think that they're doing anything wrong. The more
Mm-hmm.
evidence that they're getting, like to them, that's flirting. To them, that's like, and I think it's important for us to take their perspective too. And like, I'm a really good fawner. Like, I'm like, it's not like a good thing. Like, I get it. But there's also people who genuinely get off on crossing your boundaries. And those are the people that like, that I think are like actual, like what I would consider predators or abusers. And then like the people that you tell them this is a boundary hard line and then they keep crossing it, like huge red flag, which honestly, it's been a while since I've experienced anything like that because I've been getting really good at being like solid with my boundaries. Like if you do this again, there's going to be a fucking problem. Okay. People get a chance to change. You get a chance to change your behavior. And I don't know if they're just changing it when I'm around, but they're changing it with me at the very least.
I mean, when people get a no and they push past that no in that very clear way, that's such a clear indication
Violation.
of violation. Those are the easy in some ways. They might be in some ways more traumatic because someone literally did something that you were saying no to. But on the other hand, they're easier to figure out who did what and then what the appropriate response is, and those people can be more, in some ways, even more easily weeded out than the people who are, as you were saying, who will just approach, and they might even ask the question, can I kiss you, but they're asking it without there having been an established process of flirtation that would even invite that question. And so those are more difficult when there's those initial approaches that might lead to either a freeze or a fawn response. The only way that we can weed those out is to have those conversations. As you were saying, you come up to that person, whether in that same moment or 2 days later, a week later, whenever you're ready, because sometimes it does take a few days, a week, few weeks to actually realize that what had happened was not what you wanted to happen. And find out, why did they think that you were ready to engage in them? And what about you and your responses suggested that you are interested in continuing and maybe pointing out some of the signs. Because usually in many of these cases, whether it's a freeze or fawn, there are some signs that it's not a fuck yes, right? You may be saying a yes in some way. I mean, maybe, if you're ginger and you're really good fawner, all of those signs of potential no may be hidden. But in many of those cases, there are at least some signs of no or maybe or I'm not sure that can be pointed out to this person who failed to notice them the first time around. And yeah, I mean, sometimes they fail to notice because they just, as I was saying earlier, they're just overexcited and are failing to notice, or because of that very human thing that we all do when we are getting some ambiguous signs from people, we tend to project our own desires onto them. That, if it's not a clear no and I'm a very strong yes, then I am just sort of evolutionarily almost predisposed to assume that you are a yes too. Or, as you were saying, Ginge, these are people who are who are seeing those no's or seeing those maybes and just don't care and are pushing past that no matter what until they get to a very clear no. And I think many of the people who are in these spaces, they understand that they can't push past a no. But I think there are many of these people who will willingly and knowingly push past or ignore some initial signs of no and maybe and approach in a way that is more aggressive or more imposing so as to provoke either a freeze or a fawn response.
I also want to acknowledge that some people have different levels of being able to understand nonverbal communication. Like I have a lot of friends
Absolutely.
that are actually autistic or on the spectrum. And so
Absolutely.
that's why I would just rather land on the safer side of as soon as I see someone is interested in me and they keep trying to hit on me and I'm not interested, I will be like, look, I am just interested in connecting on a friend level. I'm still interested in connecting with you, but only on a friend level. That's it. And your rejection is your responsibility. But I feel like it's still a type of people pleasing that we might be doing instead of rejecting that person early on and establishing look, I just want to have this type of friendship. I've done it before where I'm not leading them on, but I don't want to reject them. I don't want to hurt them. I'm people pleasing in a way instead of just being look, I want to be your friend. Let's continue on a friend level. And if things ever change, things can change, but I don't want you to have any expectations of that. There's people that I have become attracted to long down the line, but that is not how I feel right now. Being able to say that to people. And if I don't feel safe enough to say that to people, then I need to either work on something or go find a different community of people because I should be able to do that. And that's how we don't rejection is part of this. How else are we going to navigate these gray areas? How else am I going to know if someone's an actual predator or if they are just bad at reading signals? And I said, the more you're not in your body and you're not embodied as a person, you're not going to be able to see how this partner is reacting to you and their body signals. And the more drugs and alcohol you introduce into the scenario, the more blind they're going to be to that person's body language. That's why I always venture on the side of, look, I'm just not attracted to you in that way or something like that. Because we have that ability to do that as humans. And some people, they like I said, they genuinely don't have the ability to read body language like that. And so what's the safe side for me or whatever the safe choice is, just to be look, this is not what I'm looking for. And like I said, I used to be so concerned about being a people pleaser. And part of that is being really worried about how the person's going to respond when you reject them, when in reality, that's their responsibility. I am only responsible for my feelings. It's a codependent, prayer, God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. I cannot change how another person is going to react to me rejecting them. So that's on you. I get rejected. It sucks, but it's part of life. I don't go raping people though when I get rejected. So deal with your shit.
Yeah, Ginger, you always crack me up. I resonate so much with the people pleaser tendencies, and just sitting back and listening to, both of you have this conversation. What it's really having me think about is how much practice we all need with these types of interactions, whether it's the practice of, rejecting
Yeah.
somebody, and rejection not needing to be a negative, and some experiencing rejection on the other end of that. And like just the practice of going into a space and being in your body, the practice of being able to communicate, hey, I'm actually not there, or hey, I didn't like that, or hey, please don't touch me that way.
Yeah.
Because these are all things that, like, as you're saying them, I'm feeling my younger self having grown up and had tidbits of these experiences. Like I said, I was on the tiptoe in of the spectrum and not like living in these communities like as you have been, Dr. Zhana. And knowing that I've actually had very little practice with a lot of this, and I've kept myself really safe by not having to do it a lot, or just kind of like being in smaller instances, or being with like just groups of friends that I already had this beautiful container with,
Hmm.
not brand new spaces with tons of people, where I was getting practice in these communication, techniques. And so, I always just kind of want to like stop and pause for the listeners to be like, the only way to get good at this is to do it. And so you've got to be willing to see like, this is an amazing sort of like conversational roadmap we're laying down, but to really know that like at the end of the day, maybe this person isn't trying to hurt you, they also don't have the skills. It doesn't make
Yeah.
it right, but it
Mhm.
also, it's on the part of both to be responsible to start to polish everything that we've got going on, and get comfortable in our own bodies with our yeses, with our nos, with our hey, not like that, or hey, not right now, or
Yeah.
I just want to be friends. And it's making me
Why
laugh
don't we
because
have anywhere to practice this though?
like this
Because
is
we
something
are
actually
not
that
because we're not born
We could
with.
practice this in ways though. Like we should have like just like taekwondo or whatever, people come up, I'm gonna take your purse. No, not my purse. It's like have a hot guy come up and like be like, all right, I promised myself I'm not gonna have sex tonight, and practice, like saying like I'm just like I'm not, like saying no to someone when you want to. Like that's what I'm saying. Irene does those. Remember we did one together, Jess? It was kind of like
yeah.
say yes when you want to say no, say yes when you like those things. Oh wait, I don't know if you're at that one. It was like I want you to feel how it feels in your body to say yes to something that you actually want to say no to.
Yeah.
So it was like the person would say, hey, can I punch you in the face? And you would be like, yes. And so it was like these different exercises to see what it feels like in your body when you're betraying yourself, when you're
Which
people pleasing, because we're not even aware of this. Like it's such a subconscious level. And I think until people are aware of it, and I think people's reactions to rejection also is extremely powerful. And that's how people feel safe, is that like a lot of these communities say when you're going to reject someone, their response should be, thank you so much for taking care of yourself. Like I am so proud and happy of you for taking care of yourself and not doing something that you didn't want to do.
yeah,
And
that's
that should be
although I honestly find that a little condescending too. Um,
okay.
I'm proud of you. Like who the fuck are you to be proud of me? It's like, so I don't know. I see the benefits of that, but yes, taking rejection uh, gracefully is really important, but trying not to be also condescending.
What do you mean by condescending?
Well, I don't know, just saying like I'm proud of you, like that. Like,
I think that since like we're such children and a lot of the time we have been pressured into saying yes when we haven't wanted to, I think this is the way that we train people to feel that they should be proud of saying yes when they or saying no when they didn't want
they
to and
sh-
things like that.
they should be proud of saying yes. I don't have the right to say that I'm proud of them for saying yes. That's like a father figure, a mother
Okay.
figure, like, good job, sweetheart. Well done,
I'll make sure not to respond to you like that. I, as someone who has struggled with this in the past, really appreciated the safeness that I felt that provided me to reject people. That was the standard. Wasn't, I mean, they're not giving you a speech on what you have to say, but they're trying to say like your response to rejection should never be like you're mad at the person or whatever. It should be
of
like, damn,
course.
like I'm proud of you for taking care of yourself.
Yeah, I see both
Thank you.
sides of it because
Thank you for
oh,
taking care of yourself better than I'm proud of you. It's the
yeah,
word I'm proud that creates a power dynamic. Basically
power
says
to
I
me.
have the power to tell you that I'm proud of you. It's like, let me be
Damn.
proud of.
I tell
Let
my
me
friends
be
I'm proud of
proud.
them all the time. I hope they don't think that I'm talking down on them.
Well, yeah, but friends are different. This is not a friend.
Okay.
I don't know. Those are
Yeah.
nuances, but
There's definitely a huge nuance here, and I see both sides of it because I think it just depends on who the person is. I can totally see and feel into that power dynamic of like a stranger saying that to me if I have rejected them. And I have actually been in a situation where I felt like it was condescending. I didn't realize it until like this moment that that's the word that I would have used. But when I am with like people that I love and that I know, it wouldn't be weird for me to hear, like, I'm
yes.
proud of you for that. And so I totally see where you're coming from, Ginger, because knowing like the communities that you hang out in and everyone, it's like a big soul family. And that would make sense there. But I do feel like with strangers, like, thank you for taking care of yourself is just a bit more clear and takes that power dynamic out of it of like, well, it puts somebody in a submissive place to be like, oh, I'm proud of you for, you know, it's like dom sub relationship, like
Right, right,
taking care of yourself, which not everybody is going to feel that way or resonate with it. So
right.
yeah, but I
But
I like the
I want
opposing
to
view.
thanks for seeing both sides, and that was kind of my point around that there are different people that you can say that without it feeling condescending, and different people that it might feel condescending. But I want to address a couple of the other things that Ginger said that I think are really important, like those practices of saying these different yeses in different ways, nos in different ways, saying yes when you're a no, no when you're a yes. That's why those are so important, and we don't often have opportunities to practice them, which is why I think it's so important to have these consent workshops and educations as part of these sex positive communities. However they get incorporated, whether it's right before a party, whether it's day before the party, whether people have to do it in some other format, I think we need to start really thinking about incorporating more and more of that. And the other thing that we also need to start incorporating, that's we haven't talked much about, that other side of being on the side of the transgressor, and people coming up to you and saying, hey, you did something that hurt me, or that didn't feel right. And how do we, so it's not just rejection, we talk about rejection, but this is after something has happened, confronting people with it. And there's a lot of defensiveness that happens often in those conversations, which is why a lot of the times the people who experience the harm don't even want to bring up anything, because they don't want to deal with that defensiveness. But that's another thing that we kind of need to practice, being in that position, because many of us will be and have been in the position of pushing past someone's boundary, whether we realize that or not, and being confronted with it and trying to accept it, or hear it without getting defensive. And that's also work that we kind of need to be doing, of learning how to have these conversations in a way that on one hand don't sound too accusatory, at least from the get-go, giving people a chance to have just simply made a mistake, as opposed to assuming the worst possible scenario when approaching them. And when we're approached with something like that, really trying to be humble and not get defensive immediately, and try to see, okay, this is what it looked like to me, but let me try and put myself in this other person's shoes and see how it was on their side. And then we all have a lesson to learn in these situations. The more clear crossing boundaries after someone has said a clear no, it's such a clear scenario, and there's not much learning that needs to happen, except just don't don't cross a no. Like, that's a very obvious one. Whereas in these
Yeah.
grayer areas, where something harmful happened because of a freeze or a fawn kind of scenario, these are actually really good opportunities for everyone to elevate their consent practices, for the person who got harmed to really get better and understand better some of those things that we're talking about, how to be in our bodies, how to really check in with ourselves before we we respond, what kinds of maybe power dynamics were present in the scenario that made us feel less or more comfortable saying yes or no, and just really kind of getting why was there something like alcohol or drugs that prevented us from, and so really learning how we could have done better on not freezing or fawning and instead saying the no that we needed to say. And on the other side, that's a great learning opportunity for people to become aware of some of these less clear, more ambiguous signals of not a fuck yeah that they might not have been aware of before. So I really want to give us all, like, I want us to think of these situations, these grayer situations, as something that, yeah, some harm can happen and does happen in those scenarios, but they're also an amazing learning opportunity that we often might not have another chance to learn until every single sex party community starts doing these practice runs and workshops. we're just we're going to have to learn on the go, and to even welcome them in some way, or look at them as something that we can learn from, and often the communities can learn from too. Because if this becomes something that, let's say, the organizers become aware of, and they're or other people become aware of, or the other people that we talk to, like, if I had something, like when something happened to me and I talked about it with Jessica and Ginger, and we analyzed it and dissected it, I think we all learned from that in ways that we wouldn't have if that had not happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is like a great sort of segue into what I think we want to talk about next, which is like also what is the right way to go about like bringing this conversation to and with your friends or your peers or whoever your support system is, and leading from like, this is my experience, right? This is like what happened to me, and not, like you said, just jumping to like worst case scenario, or not giving someone the benefit of the doubt. I think before we wrap that point, and Ginger, you can add if you want to, but I wanted to say, I think one of the things that I learned from this situation was bringing things up to like an organizer or facilitator is always going to benefit from having like a mediator. Like when you offered, actually, for me, I was like, oh, I never even thought of that. That would actually make me feel so much more comfortable. And, knowing that you both had very long conversations, discussing things of this nature, with certain people as, organizers of this community, to think that like that much time went into, discussing and going back and forth and sharing experiences. It's like, to have someone who's a neutral party to help navigate the conversation so both people can come with their experience, and then have someone who's objective, is always going to be very helpful at the end of the day. Because also, we're not only experiencing like learning all these communication tools, but things become emotional because there's either accusation or you're reliving your trauma or a mix of both. And so I think having a neutral party there is going to like up level the communication of this community massively. And also then we don't go and like share it multiple times. It's almost like if we could normalize having a more roundtable discussions, I think we would all learn more and faster. And I think there was something else that totally escaped me. But, I do want to talk about like something that came up for me, and I think all of us, because Ginger, you pointed it out. You were like, well, I don't want to necessarily continue this conversation without like figuring out where we're going with it, because we're also, I think we had like talked about it enough that we all felt like good in sharing like knowledge and experiences that was helpful. But then at what point, and not that we were becoming gossipy, but it's like, then what is the benefit, and where do we sort of take it and do something practical and educational and helpful with it so we can all grow? Because to bring back up the question, since this is an asking for a friend episode, we had this question come in from a listener that had an experience at a party community, that's a well-known community, established community in New York City, that they explained their experience that was very uncomfortable, and that they felt like certain people were creepy and they didn't feel right. But then there was also, the listener described a lot of sort of hearsay, and that they said, I've heard, that these people have attended these parties and that these things are going down, which, as we chatted about, went into the realm of like conspiracy theory.
Mhm.
And so to be good community members and to be like great allies and to stay grounded, taking each other's experiences into account and wanting to support each other in like experiences or spaces of like trauma or harm, then how do we navigate that, and where do we draw the line before we're like, wait a minute, was this your experience, or is this a projection of things that you've heard or other people's experiences that you're taking into account that weren't yours, who aren't present here speaking about that at this moment? And how do we navigate that?
Like a journalistic standard is called a primary source. So if someone says, this is my experience, what I experienced at that party, good fact. If they say friend of a friend, so and so, it gets less and less credible. And I think there's also a psychological term called triangulation. And so I think that if you're going to continue to be in a community, but you're talking about the problems to other people outside of the community, it's not going to benefit the community. Like if someone transgresses you, you don't have to, but the best, most healthy way, if you're going to continue to have a relationship with that person, is to talk to that person. Like, of course, we all have friends that we get advice from and things like that. But yes, at what point, I feel like if I'm going to continue to have a relationship with a person, or if I'm going to continue to be in that community, I put it on my list eventually to get around to try and tell that person how they transgressed me. And honestly, at that point, I leave it up to them. Like if they're emotionally intelligent, that's the thing. Like they'll have the ability to like internalize and think about like, how did I potentially cross this person's boundaries? And if they don't, they're immediately going to start blaming you. They're going to make themselves the victim. It's like a pattern of behavior. But we need to be able to see like a person is a safe space if they're able to take that information, take that feedback, and change their behavior going forward. But I also have no expectations. Like I can't control what another person does. So it's important that what I can do is I can give them my feedback. And I have with like literally anyone who has ever sexually assaulted me. I've reached back out to people in the past and I'm like, look, I never fucking told you this, but I did not want to be having that sex with you. It fucking traumatized me. I've had to work it out in therapy. I don't want you to hurt other people going forward. I do what you want with this information, but I needed to tell you this. And for the most part, I don't get bad responses. And if I do, that's just a sign that that person doesn't need to be in my life, because I don't want people who externalize and constantly blame their problems on other people. I want people who realize like, oh shit, I might have made a mistake, but I want to learn and I don't want to make that mistake going forward. And so that's where I think my personal responsibility lies. But like I said, how another person wants to respond is on them. That's fine. They can respond however they want. They can respond however they want to being transgressed, to being the transgressor, but your consequences have actions. Not telling people how they hurt you has actions, and telling them how they hurt you is going to have actions. But for my experience, telling a person how they hurt me is always had more good than bad. And even if they respond negatively in the moment, it's in their fucking mind. They're never going to unhear that they hurt you doing that. So they're either going to become more sadistic or they're going to it's in there. They're going to internalize it and change. And having uncomfortable conversations fucking sucks. That's why I've appreciated some people who have reached out to me and they're like, look, Ginger, you're acting weird. Did I do something wrong? And I'm like, yes, look, I have been I wanted to get around to this conversation, but who wants to have a conversation like this? Nobody wants to have conversations like that. Yeah, I was getting around to it, but I lead my conversations with love. I genuinely tell them all, and I can separate a person from their behavior. And I tell them that too. Look, I love you as a person, but what you do fucking sucks. And if you don't change that, like, your reputation precedes you too. Remember that as you as a person, you as a community, whether or not you're creating a safe space, who you're letting into these spaces, that all is part of your reputation. And if someone has a reputation as being very, very harmful and people know that they're going to your parties, that's going to reflect on you as an organizer and your organization. So
I love that, Ginger. I love that you've basically told everyone who's ever harmed you, more or less.
Yeah.
I hope that
Making
encourages Yeah, I hope that encourages some of the listeners, because that's not an easy thing to do. I mean, you are an outlier in this case. You're not the norm,
Malcolm
right?
Gladwell.
Well, yeah, it's not an easy thing to do. And there needs to be a lot of power, agency, assertiveness that someone has in order to confront these people who, um, harm them in some way, shape, or form. And so I hope people get encouraged to do more of that by this conversation. But I do want to also acknowledge that many things can make that more difficult. And to go back to the listener's question that Jessica talked about, in that case, this person had sort of a negative experience. They got some kind of aggressive and um, narcissistic vibes from the three people who run that party, right? Literally, the three people who are in charge, they felt that all three of those gave them these sort of negative vibes. And then what do you do? In a case, who do you complain to, right? Who do you go to? And that's why, you might really not want to go to those three people. And so, but then what happens? And I don't know. I think that's when some of these other, when we were talking about this episode, Jessica was talking about sort of the sisterhood, way of thinking about this. And yeah, that's when I think these other people who are either other people at the party or other people who you might know are connected to that sort of community, who might be able to broker some kind of a conversation or mediate some kind of a conversation that you might not feel comfortable having directly. That's when that really comes in. But we have to talk about this. And I know this is an anonymous form that people submitted, but I would really want to encourage this person to find a way to confront these organizers about their inappropriate behavior, whether that's directly or through some of these indirect channels. Come to me. I know that community. If you're listening, it's one of the communities that I have been in the past closely associated with. And because I think it's really, really important to address these kinds of things especially when they come from the organizers themselves. Right? It's much easier when it's a bad seed that's a guest, and the organizers are the ones really being careful about how consent is or isn't, um, acted on. But it's when they are the ones being the rules, then we have a really serious problem, and can't let that happen. And it's so easy to when you have that power, it's kind of often easy to get a little cocky and overly sort of confident about what you are doing.
Yeah. It's almost like it makes me want to ask the question, do you feel like it even makes sense for in these spaces the organizers or the owners or the facilitators of the party to also be playing, to be engaging with guests at the party, because it does create such a power dynamic. And at the end of the day, it's like, is that also too much to ask? Because the reason these people are doing this is
Right.
because they also love the things that
Right.
come with the lifestyle, which are beautiful things. You're here clearly because you like sex and want to enjoy and pleasure. And, a lot of this conversation has been about the shadow side of these spaces. But, is it too much to ask? You don't have to answer this, but for these organizers to also stay disengaged. And
Yeah.
does that contribute to a much safer space?
I've thought
That's why
about
I'll
that.
never start my own play party.
I've thought about it quite a bit, Surgeon General. I'll give you a chance, but I have thought about it a lot, and it's not an easy question to answer because, yeah, these people are throwing a party because they want to play at that party, right? And so taking that away from them entirely, I feel like is maybe too much to ask. I also think, though, that if they are going to play, they maybe should be held to a different set of standards of who they play with and how they negotiate that play. Are they, there are lots of different people you could be playing with. If you don't have to be playing with the people who are there for the first time, for example. maybe you play with people who you have played with before, or maybe you make some connections and you have a date with some of those people separately, and then maybe you play at a party. So I don't know, there's pros and cons, but there needs to be definitely a lot more intentionality and care being put into these. And I think that's the case with all of these different situations that we talked about. The more there's different levels of risk that we can all take in these situations that should be moderated based on a number of different factors. Like for example, the more power dynamic there is between the people, the more one should err on the side of caution. The more inexperienced someone is, the more conflicted someone is, the more you don't know somebody, the more that person is new and you don't know them, the less you've had a chance to find out where they're at. All of those factors make it so that it's a better idea to err on the side of caution as opposed to err on the side of risk. Whereas, the less of those factors exist, the more you can be like, yeah, I can take a risk here. And so it's that, or even things like, as Ginger was saying earlier, people who are not great at reading signals. Like, know that about yourself. If you're not great at reading nonverbal signals, then you should put extra care into making sure that the people you are trying to engage with are indeed willing to engage with you. And so, yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think?
Gingy, are you starting your own play party?
No, but Irene just said that you were going to the same one in September, right? Irene said
yeah.
Okay, cool. I was totally be down for that. I think that we need to start thinking of sex in terms of harm reduction personally, just like drugs, all right? Like, if you're someone who's approaching someone, if you're someone who's being approached, there's different ways you can think of it in terms of harm reduction, all right? The more I know the person, there's probably less harm involved because I know the person more. As a organizer, potentially thinking about whether or not they're going to have sex with someone, I think that they just need to, like I said, hold themselves to a higher standard. Like, people they have previous relationships with, super enthusiastic consent. Come on, we know what that looks like. Like, just only that. Like, all right, sorry, no gray area. People should always be holding themselves to that standard. But when I think of sex and I try to destigmatize it, I try to think of it like dancing. Honestly, like, that's the analogy that I give myself if I'm like stigmatizing it, if I'm holding it to a different level, is dancing. Like, would I think of it would be weird if a group organizer of an organization is like and I know there's a lot of pressure and stuff that goes on with sex, but like, no, as long as they're doing it in a healthy way and they're not harming anyone. But same thing with alcohol. The more alcohol that's involved, the more drugs that are involved, potentially the higher level of risk or harm that is involved. And if we start thinking of it in terms of harm reduction, it's a very unstigmatized way of talking about it. And I think that that's it. Like, all I care is about doing this with people who are conscious and who do care. And that reduces like 90% of the intentional abusers and predators and things like that. Because I don't know. And I know it sounds fucked up and people are going to hate to hear this, but even predators are fucking human beings who have thoughts and feelings and emotions. And so I try to empathize with everybody so I can understand their motivations and understand like how this shit happens. Because I know that we just want to like label them as such, but they're still human beings that like got to that point somehow. And I want to understand that, because just like with addicts saying like, don't do drugs, like, I think you can tell when rapists don't rape is like pretty much like, I think they would have stopped by now if that worked. So I think we need to like figure out what are their motivations. Come on, talk about it. And if you guys aren't willing, then we can start to see the signs in other people. And that's how we know potentially I'm not letting you into my safe space because your behavior is not safe. Love you as a person, but your behavior isn't safe. Until that changes, you don't get access to this community. And so like I think it's great when people have anonymous feedback forums in this communities, and then they have some sort of a committee that is comprised of multiple, like lots of different genders, lots of age ranges, lots of diversity, because everybody's experiences are different. And they give that person feedback on how their behavior has affected the person. And then you see if their behavior changes. You have to give a person an ability to change their behavior. Obviously, obviously, if it's egregious, if someone's roofing someone, you get them out of your community immediately. But in these, like, people need to have the ability to grow and change if we want to make the world a better place. And I am always going to give them that space to change their behavior before I ostracize them, because the fear of ostracizing people, like, that is fucking deeply ingrained. And we need to realize that, like, that is what these people are afraid of when we bring them their transgressions. Okay? Like, that is the fear that they are experiencing when we bring them. They're afraid that they're going to be rejected from their communities. And I want to let them know, like, you have the ability to stay in this community, stay in my life if your behavior changes, and let them know that I still love you, because, like, a safe space, like, that has to apply to these people too. I know people don't want, like, but we need to understand that, like, creating a safe space that benefits everybody. And I want to do that for people. Like, you can fuck up, but I need to come to you, tell you you fucked up. And I guess I do have expectations. I have a level of expectations when it comes to how I expect to be treated by my friends and the people I let into my circle. But you control that. I control whether or not you have access to me.
Yeah, I think we should be allowed to fuck up, but not to not learn from those fuck ups. And that's kind of how I like to run my business. That's how I like to run my friendships, my loverships. We're allowed to make mistakes. We're not allowed to not learn from those mistakes. And someone is refusing to learn from those mistakes, then that's the point at which they need to leave my organization or friendship or lovership and so on.
I think this is like such a beautiful place to kind of put the end cap on this episode, because what you're both sharing here is, the biggest thing that we can take away is, like, we are all trying to heal and grow, right, and get better. And the moment that we sort of, put someone over there and put them in a box and punish, we sort of take away the ability to learn and grow from that situation. Of course, like we said, with egregious things or where people are
Yeah.
beyond growing and are not going to learn, and that's clear, then of course removal. But it's only in understanding the motivations and the
Yeah.
hurt, little person inside that's coming out to retaliate. That's the only way that we're going to be able to educate the rest of us and the younger generations coming up and make these spaces safer and safer. And at the end of the day, that's like what we all want. I think that's why the three of us came together today, is like, how do we navigate this? How do we be good friends and good peers and good allies and great teachers for each other and for the organizers and the future organizers and planners? So if you're listening to this and you're thinking about either attending a party or starting your own, like, there's a lot of great do's and don'ts in here. There's some red flags. There's some things to consider. The older I get, the less I drink. I've been alcohol sober for 7 months now, and I don't think I'm turning back. So definitely put that one in your pocket, because I think that it leads to a much safer space. I mean, I'm just being silly at this point, but I really just appreciate both of your time and your energy and all the work and thought and love that you put into these spaces, both of you.
You too.
Yeah, if you want to share anything else before we wrap, but
Yeah. I think that, I don't know, it's been my purpose on earth to change the way we think about and view sex. And I think it's beautiful that the type of community that these sex positive spaces can create, because I truly see people being like their truest versions of their self, whatever you want to call that, because people really do have to hide their sexuality or change it to fit in society. And I think it's beautiful. Like, whoever is listening, you could be the person who starts that sex positive space and community in your area, because at the end of the day, like, we all have these desires and feelings, and there's no obligation to have sex at these. It's just creating a space where people can be, like, sexually free and sexually open-minded, and that in itself is beautiful.
Yes. Yeah, these spaces really are the adult playgrounds that are are only for adults, and they literally are these, like, we can be the kids that we used to be on the kids playground. We can be those kids in these spaces, and it's a really beautiful thing to have. And so I really want to encourage people to make them safer and safer, as opposed to, one thing I've noticed often happens is these communities, they 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 start with the best intentions, and then things go wrong, and then they get tarnished because things have gone wrong. And back to what Jessica was saying earlier, sometimes these things that have gone wrong end up getting blown up into rumors that are actually not accurate, and that gets spread, and they sort of blow up and end up ending. And then a new one a new community gets formed, and then that community goes through the exact same cycle, and we just go over and over and over again. And I think maybe instead of kind of having this very kind of strict, like, if anything has gone wrong in any community, we have to shut it down and start anew. Maybe really thinking about how can we learn and make it better, and continue to evolve it and grow it and keep what's good. Because in many of these communities, they usually started because there were some really good ideas with some really well-intentioned people wanting to do something really good for that community. And so let's keep that while dealing with the bad, and learn from the bad, because there's no way to not have the bad stuff happen.
I love that. It's like keep the community growing and changing and collecting the wisdom rather than like burn it all down and then we have infancy again and again and again.
Right.
Yeah.
Go through the same growing pains each time. Like, let's learn from those growing pains and let's grow.
Cycle of suffering. We can only get out of this cycle of suffering if we do something different. And like if we keep running away from these uncomfortable conversations, these people aren't going to actually realize that they didn't anything wrong in the first place. And so like that's why, like, even if I'm going to leave the community, I'm going to let you know before I leave.
Wow. Thank you, ladies, so much. Lovers and friends of Open Late Podcast, that is a wrap on Ginger and Dr. Zhana and our 100th episode. It's wild. It's been a beautiful journey. And 100 episodes in the book. Like, I'm kind of like patting myself on the back a little bit. And having conversations like this with incredible minds and guests and full communities sometimes, like in our WhatsApp chat, our peer support space, always inspire me so much because everyone has a different perspective. And it's so important that we can come from a place of like hearing other people and understanding their perspective and having compassion for where we all are, because we're all at a different spot in our journey. So how I experience something is going to be different than how you experience something. But I think hearing about our different experiences allows us to rest and relax a little bit and know that like conversations are the key to moving forward in a healthy way. So I hope that you enjoyed this as much as I did. And I hope that you love being on this wild, open late journey as much as I do. As always, if you liked this episode, please leave us a review and let us know what you liked about it and why. If you have questions like the listener today whose question we shared, you can leave that question on our website. There is a box called Asking for a Friend, and you can do that anonymously. If you have a question and you want me to know who you are, wait for our once a week Q&A on Instagram, because I tend to answer all of those, sometimes in reels, but then also in episodes. And yeah, there's so much happening on our new website. So please go check it out and let me know what you think. openlatepodcast.com. All of our free resources are there. All of our affiliate links for companies and organizations that sponsor this show and that I love to collab with. Again, Dr. Zhana has the Open Smarter course, and she's giving all of our listeners 30% off of the total cost of that course when you pay in full. That's a huge discount. It's very generous. And if you want to split it up into payments, you can do that too, and you get 30% off your first payment. So all of that and so much more on our website. I will see you back next week for episode 101. Have an amazing week and stay sexy, lovers.